All right, I guess we'll kick it off. Hello everybody. My name is Paul. I'm the founder of Octopus Deploy. Damien Brady was originally hosting this, but he wasn't able to make it today, so I'll be your host. My guest today is Alex Yates. Alex has spent the last 7 years working at Redgate, and now he runs a consultancy called DLM Consultants. DLM, of course, being database lifecycle management. Hi, Alex.
Hey Paul, how's it going?
I'm good. It's 1 o'clock in the morning for me, so the time was originally set. Assuming Damien would be hosting this, he's in Canada where it's a nice friendly time. I'm in Brisbane, Australia, where it's 1 o'clock. So if I say anything too foolish, forgive me. I hope the time should be a bit better for you, though, I think.
Yeah, the time's fine for me. I mean, as I say, I originally planned it with Damien based on UK and Canada time zones, and sorry.
That's all right. Well, I'm sure I'll stay wide awake during this anyway because I'm really excited about this topic. So when I talk to customers, database deployments are sort of the last thing that they automate, partly because they're technically hard. There's a lot of data to manage. They're very risky. We don't want to make a mistake when something goes wrong. And databases historically have teams of DBAs and people who are really specialized in looking after them. And so there's also the cultural changes that have to go with automating them. So it's a topic that comes up a lot when I'm talking to customers. You're an expert on this topic, so I'm really looking forward to seeing you run through the different approaches people can use for doing their database migrations and show some of the options. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end of this. So you'll find for everyone watching in the questions panel of GoToWebinar, postings in there. If we get quiet spots during a demo, I'll read them out and we'll have heaps of time for questions at the end. Try and make them really hard. Let's get the most use out of Alex while he's here. Over to you, Alex.
I'd appreciate if they're not too hard. Yeah, hi. As Paul says, I had a decent stint at Redgate, a few years at Redgate, helping organizations to implement DevOps continuous delivery solutions for SQL Server databases primarily, a bit of Oracle and MySQL, but primarily SQL Server. It strikes me that we use a slightly different set of language a lot of the time when we speak to SQL Server people and when we speak to the rest of folks. I mean, anybody who's read any books about software development in the last 15 or 20 years have been reading about some of the same concepts, some of the same words. As an industry, we've kind of worked out that a few things make sense when writing software. Sticking stuff in source control, trying to do stuff in small iterations, deploy small chunks of work together because there's less chance something's going to go wrong, automating everything that can be automated. Frankly, we don't do long division by hand anymore. We use calculators. For repetitive, boring tasks that need to happen the same, reliable every single time, we should be using computers for that. That's what computers were made for. So we need to be using our humans and our computers appropriately. So a lot of very, very sensible things have been happening in the software development space. A bunch of we've been source controlling stuff, we've been integrating code regularly, we've been deploying in small batches, we've been automating deployments. But one of the ideas that's come out of the whole DevOps movement is that if it's hard, do it often. But that's not what I'm seeing in practice. What I'm seeing in practice is people ignoring the database, people leaving the database till last, people having to deal with these horrible legacy databases because they haven't been refactoring them over time, because they're terrified of refactoring, because they don't have an easy ability to roll back, they're not source controlling stuff, they don't have good enough testing, which means they don't know if they break stuff, which means they don't have a lot of confidence to do the standard kind of cleanup refactoring jobs that we would normally do with the rest of our code. That leads to the first of 5 anti-patterns that I'm going to talk you through. Now, I do have a separate rant of anti-patterns that is about 16 anti-patterns long, and if you're interested in that, go to dlm.com, dlmconsultants.com/speaking to see the full version of this. But I'd like to highlight 5, and the first one is wait until you're already screwed. This is a guaranteed way to screw up your ability to deliver database updates, okay? How many of us have to deal with a horrible legacy database, or how many of us in the past have had to? The point where you've reached that technical debt singularity, where the amount of busy work that you have to do takes up 100% of your time, and you just don't have time to deliver new features anymore. It's all you're doing is fixing stuff that's broken. Um, a lot of the time when we have a system like this, we hear about things like source control, testing, automated deployment, and we think that would save us so much time. It would be wonderful to be able to take those ideas and apply them to a legacy database. Trouble is that when you're simultaneously trying to learn how to do all of that stuff and apply it to a database at the same time as dealing with all of those legacy quirky issues on your production system, on your legacy system, it's just very, very difficult to tie all of that together. Um, Simultaneously, a lot of people have a legacy database and they've got like a really nice, easy, small greenfield project where they don't yet see the benefit of source control and testing and deployment because it's so easy and greenfield and lovely. Um, I'm going to say to you that actually they're exactly the sorts of systems where we should be. They're exactly the sort of systems where we should be trying this stuff out because they're the great sort of systems to learn how to use the software tools, how to use practices, learn the basics of how to do this stuff on a nice, easy greenfield project, and then once you've learned how to do database source control, then go and tackle the big legacy system once you've actually got a little bit of a few skills with it. Bear with me. Right, so that's the first anti-pattern. Don't wait until you're too late. Don't wait until you're too late. Don't wait until you're too late. Actually, apply it to apply it to your nice, easy greenfield projects first. The second anti-pattern I'd like to talk about is having a functional standoff. I mean, it's almost a joke now. It's almost the whole idea of the wall of confusion and dev versus ops, and it's almost a cliche of DevOps, so that's what it's all about. But actually, nowhere is that more true than in database world, where we have teams of database developers and teams of database DBAs, where you've got those two separate teams. I've seen many occasions where those two groups of people haven't worked together as well as they should. They say DevOps is about culture as well as tools, and yes, it is, and nowhere is that more visible than in the way that we manage our SQL Server updates that typically have to get approved by a bunch of different people. One example of that is an organization that I went to called Farm Credit Services of America. This is back when I worked for Redgate a couple of years ago. The guy on the left here is a production DBA. He's called John Morehouse. And he was responsible for managing the production databases for this company. There are about 100 different developers or people in the IT team, of which they were split into about 14 different sub-teams, each of which were doing different things for source control. Some of them were source controlling, some of them weren't. If they were using source control, they're using different source control systems. They're using Git, TFS. Some of them were using ORMs, some of them were using SSDT, some of them were using Redgate tools, some of them were using just a bunch of upgrade scripts manually added to source control. So of all these different people doing different things, it becomes very, very, very difficult for that ops guy, that DBA, to actually maintain this. So applying one sensible process to streamline the entire process made a big difference there. When we go to implement that process, the next thing that people get wrong is they pick the wrong approach for them. Now, people debate endlessly about the model and the migrations approach to database source control, and we'll talk about that a bit today, and I'm sure Paul will interject because I know he has some opinions on this. In actual fact, for the last couple of years, whenever I've given a talk about model versus migrations, I've quoted Paul as one of the people that believes in the migrations way of working. So perhaps we'll have a bit of debate about that a bit later on. But my view is that they're two perfectly good approaches. Both have their flaws. Neither are perfect. And you need to pick the one that's right for you. And a lot of people get that wrong, and they pick the wrong approach, and they end up getting burned by it. So we'll talk a bit about that. Finally, the last thing that people get wrong is they reinvent the wheel. They don't like the tools that are available. They don't want to spend money on tools. They feel like they're better off just building it for themselves. Now, with the greatest respect, there are people like Paul and others who have spent the last, I don't know how many years, possibly with development teams of dozens or hundreds of people, building software tools to solve these processes, to solve these problems. you're probably not a special snowflake. I hate to break it to you. Most of the time, the tools that are available are probably going to work well for you. Okay. Sometimes you might need to tweak your process a bit to fit in with the tooling, and that's annoying. But I tell you, it's a lot less annoying than building your own system. In almost all cases, you're better off using off-the-shelf software than using stuff that you've built yourself. Because, as I say, a team of dozens or hundreds of people over many, many years have solved all of the bugs that you've not even thought of yet. And they're going to do a better job than you're going to do in an afternoon. So do use the stuff that comes off the shelf. Now, I'm not saying go and buy an expensive product. I mean, there are good open source solutions. There are good solutions from Microsoft, for example, when it comes to SQL Server. And there are good commercial tools as well. So do look at what's available. But where possible, like, it's one of the points of object-oriented programming, right? Is to build for reusability, and where people have solved particular problems, let's use the stuff that they've provided for us. So we're going to end up building some sort of automated deployment pipeline: source control, continuous integration, release management. You've probably all seen a diagram a bit like this before. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. By the way, my wife did make me correct this slide because she felt a bit sorry for the kitten. So as I said, there's this model and this migrations approach. Okay, so the model-based approach takes a view that you should be building the thing that you want to end up with, the desired state, the model. That's a thing that is important. That's what should go in source control. And then how you actually get there is kind of an afterthought. We'll work that out later on. But the thing that actually goes into source control is defining what you actually want to achieve. And the other way of thinking is a migrations-based solution, where you're not so focused on that, or you kind of are, but the main priority, the main thing in your head, the main thing that goes into source control is a migration script. It's an upgrade script. Okay, it is typically you will have some sort of table on your database called version number or migration history or something like that. You'll have a list of migration scripts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You run them in sequence the same way every single time against every single environment. You might start by querying that migration history table and saying, right, well, you're already up to version 7, so now I'll run scripts 8, 9, and 10. And then you're running the same scripts in the same order on every single environment, which is a relatively straightforward concept to understand. It's relatively easy to write yourself, except use one of the open source solutions that are out there for free. And that's the other way of working. Both ways have their merits. As I said, people have strong opinions about one way being the right way and the other way being the wrong way. So here's a quote from somebody. There's nothing more reliable than keeping track of exactly the scripts you intend to run and running them without trying to compare state and guess. So this is someone that clearly believes in the migrations way of the migrations approach. You can actually find that on some Octopus Deploy documentation page. That's Paul Stovell that wrote that. Paul, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and the other reason I'm a big fan of this is Octopus itself is a product that we sell to thousands of people, and every time we update it, we have to send them changes to the database, and so we package them up as migration scripts. And the main reason I'm a big fan of this is actually, as a developer, it forces you to think about not only like, here's the change I want to make to the schema, but also how you're going to get there. It's sort of, because I feel like with the other approach, you sort of think about, okay, now I'm going to have 2 columns, but you don't put as much thought into like how you're actually going to apply that change in production and what happens. So what I like about doing this is that it forces people to think about not only what the end desired state is going to look like, but also how you'll get there. And then because it's the same script, you're running it in every environment. Because one of the things we find with Octopus is, of course, people use Octopus for production deployments, but they don't do production deployments that often. They do way more, an order of magnitude more deployments to test and dev environments. And so if it's exactly the same script, and as long as you haven't had any sort of drift in the production database, people changing stuff into production, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, then it should be a very deterministic thing. It should be guaranteed to run. So anyway, I can rant about this forever, but I'll hand it back to you.
That is a big if, though, if I might interject, that changes aren't happening on production. I know they definitely shouldn't, but in the real world, sometimes the purity of the approach in the real world, and it doesn't quite work as well. I'm not for a moment condoning people making hotfix changes on production where they could be avoided. I'd like to put that out there. We'll come back on the caveat I put there where they can be avoided a bit later. So Paul is with us in the room, so he's had his opportunity to make his case for the migrations way of working. I personally I can see the benefits of both sides, but given that we don't have anyone here to defend the model way of working, perhaps I'll try and make a case for that. So somebody else said that as soon as you have multiple changes on a single aspect of an object, ordering and the ability to detect which change needs to be made gets very complicated. That's certainly true. That was Gert Drapers, who he's from Microsoft. He's the guy that built DataDude, and that's what later became Visual Studio Database Projects and SSDT. And that's a really good piece of software that really solves a lot of the problems that you have with the migrations way of working. Essentially, what Gerd is saying here is it is a pain. It is difficult to manage all of those migration scripts. If you are only shipping database updates reasonably infrequently and you only have a small team, then it's not too hard to keep track of 4 or 5 migration scripts that you need to run in sequence. But if you are primarily a database-focused thing, if most of the business logic is in your database, maybe you are just responsible for the BI and reporting systems and it's purely database work that you're doing, and let's say you're a large team and you've got lots and lots of changes going through this system, then actually trying to keep track of all of those different migration scripts can be quite difficult, as we'll get to later. Paul is giving me a frown. He doesn't agree with me, and that's fine. That's fine. So I wrote a blog post a little while ago. Actually, I should probably put that in the chat window. I should probably just find the link for that and stick it in the chat window, just for reference. So I'm going to stick that into the chat window here. There you are. So that's the post that I put. It had a fair amount of people commenting on it. As I suggested beforehand. Lots of people have strong opinions about one being right or the other being right. I'd like to say, by the way, that actually they weren't all one-sided. Different people had different opinions, and that kind of emphasizes my point. Now my computer is going way too slow because I have far too many windows open, so let's close that one. There we are. So what I'd like to do is walk through an example using both a model and a migrations approach, and I'll use various different tools. I'll mention various different tools along the way that I'm using, so that you can kind of see that both of them can work very well. Either approach can work very well. And then after that, I'll talk you through a scenario to explain why both approaches can bite you and the problems you can have with both approaches, and we'll see that. So in this example I've put together, I've just got a very, very simple database. So this isn't a real-world project. I've dumbed down the database to be as simple as possible, purely to demonstrate the concept here. So you can imagine it's kind of a trustatrader.com type website. Compare all the local tradespeople and pick whoever it is you want to hire to do whatever. And I have a table full of kitten trainers. Pardon me. I have a table full of kitten trainers. It's a very important job role. And one of my very important clients has said it's really important that they are able to filter this list based on whether or not the kitten trainers accept tiger cubs. It's an important part of what they do. So I've had to add the kitten trainers. I've had to add that column to the table, and also I have the people in London, because London is the most important city, the people in London want a specific view so that they can see just the kitten trainers in London. We're going to create a London version of this website, and we're just going to have that view there.
This sounds very cool, Alex.
As I say, I've deliberately contrived a very simple pair of changes to try and demonstrate the difference between the model and the migrations approach, and also to walk through I'm going to look at 3 different tools that we can use to achieve this. Obviously there's SSDT that we could use, which is probably the default option which most of the attendees have probably used or looked at before. That's inside Visual Studio. It's a free model-based solution. So what I wanted to do is I want to show you three different ones, three different solutions. So I'm going to show you Redgate SQL Source Control, which is kind of a model-based way of working. I'm going to show you ReadyRoll, which there's a free version of it now available in Visual Studio Enterprise 2017. And that's kind of a migrations way of working, but it does have some hybrid features. And I'm going to show you Flyway, which is an example of an open source migrations-based tool, which does more or less exactly the same thing that Paul was promoting earlier on today. So let's jump into my virtual machine. So I'm in Octopus Deploy. We're probably all fairly familiar with this screen, and I've got a few projects: a Flyway project, an SSDT project, a ReadyRoll project, and a Toolbelt project. As I say, I'm thinking about time, and I think we'll leave SSDT just because I think most people, or a good number of you, have probably already seen it. But I will spend a bit more time on Flyway, ReadyRoll, and the Redgate SQL Toolbelt. So let's look at my databases in Management Studio, and just for simplicity, I have trainers Flyway dev and test, trainers RR for ReadyRoll dev and test, and trainers SOC. That's the shorthand we used while I worked at Redgate for SQL Source Control, because SC was already taken. That was SQL Compare, and SC was SQL Server Central, so it couldn't be. So we had to come up with something different. So SOC became the shorthand that all the Redgaters use for SQL Source Control. So we've got trainers SOC dev and trainers SOC test, and SSDT dev and test. So I've got this script that I'm going to execute to make the changes. To add the accepts tiger cubs field, and to also alter this view with this where clause, because I only care about people in London. And there's like a foreign key relationship to the London table in my cities table. So I'm going to run this. First of all, I'll just execute this against the dev database for ReadyRoll and for SQL Source Control. And now I'm going to show you how I'm going to source control that with both ReadyRoll and SQL Source Control, and then I'll do Flyway afterwards. So ReadyRoll trainers ReadyRoll dev. Let's do source control first, because that's probably simpler and easier from where we are right now. So if I go to, so Redgate SQL Source Control is a plugin to Management Studio, which allows people to source control their database directly from the IDE that they want to use, which for a lot of developers is Management Studio. If you're a Visual Studio developer, then that doesn't really apply. But if you like working in Management Studio, and demo gods, of course, my Management Studio has decided to go very slow on me purely at the time that I want to start demoing. It's probably installing updates or something in the background. But this is going to show me the differences between what I have on my local database and what's in source control. So I can see the two changes here, the new accepts tiger cubs column and the change to the view as well. So I can write some comment. Please write nicer comments than that. And I can commit that to source control, and that's going to script out all the objects, stick them into source control for me. And I can do a quick push with that to push that up to my remote Git repository as well. And just quickly while we're here, because I forgot to put my triggers on my builds, I'm just going to click the run button to make sure that runs. And while that's running, I'm going to go back to Management Studio, and what I want to show you is I want to show you in source control how that's actually represented. So I have a SQL script for each of the tables, and for example, the kitten trainers table. If I take a look at this, you'll notice it's a create statement, and that's the key point here. We have create table. Even though what we actually executed was an alter statement, we're defining it as a create table. We're defining the desired end state rather than the actual upgrade script. What's happening now is I've got a build process using some other Redgate tools to compile all of those scripts, basically create a brand new database, deploy all the scripts to them, make sure it can do that okay, package it up, and then pass it across my NuGet package to Octopus Deploy for deployment. So that's quite nice. So that'll all go through, and it'll work its way through the pipeline. Next, I'm going to go into ReadyRoll, which is kind of a similar concept. I need to jump into Visual Studio for this, but I've set ReadyRoll up to compare my development database. I'm pointing it at the ReadyRoll development database. I'm comparing that against a solution in source control. And you'll notice the solution in source control up here on the right. I should probably use Zoom it or something. You'll notice my solution in source control is just a regular Visual Studio solution. And it's split into two groups. So first of all, I've got these migrations. This is just an ordered list of migration scripts. You can see 001, 002, an ordered list of migration scripts that do various different things, just the scripts that we're running in order, like Paul had described. The nice hybrid-y thing you can set it up to do is you can put all of your programmable objects into a separate tree structure, and I'll show you the impact of that in a minute. So first of all, I can see kind of the difference again between my source control and my I can see the differences between my source control and my project, and I can import that to generate the script. And if you notice, what's going to happen at this point is it's going to script out the view as a create statement, because that's classed as a programmable object, but it's going to script out the table change as an alter statement. So you can see a third script has been added here, and this contains the alter statement for the table. And there we are. So this is what someone who favors a migrations way of working would want to see. An alter table, just tell me what you're going to do to the table and I can run the script in order. Once I've added these scripts to the project, I can right-click and check that in. And that'll go and run a build and do the deployment. Write some comment.
So just to recap that one, so that was comparing the database and generating the script, but you're checking that it's, what we're not doing is just storing the model, we're actually storing the generator script so that we can run that, and it's exactly the same script that's going to run in each of the environments. So you kind of get the dev time experience of being able to compare, but not kind of trusting that to run in production.
Exactly, that's right. And the upgrade script that gets created here, you can edit that if you want to. There's a cool refresh verify scripts option here, which will create a temporary database for you, run all of your scripts in sequence, and check that you've ended up with something that's the same. So if I wanted to, I could edit that script. Let's say I didn't like the way that the code had generated the script for me. I wanted to handle it in a slightly different way. Maybe let's say I've renamed a column, and the software has interpreted that as a drop and a create, but I want to make sure I use SP rename on that column to actually update it correctly. I can tweak it and massage it to make sure that it doesn't give me any data loss, or that it performs the way I need it to, and then it will save that for me. So that's quite nice. The last option I wanted to show you was, sorry, was there another question?
I just wanted to say I like the programmable objects folder. One of the most annoying things when you have, in our case, we've got probably a few hundred migration scripts now, is always just finding which one has the latest copy of a view or a store procedure or something like that, having to kind of hunt backwards through them or search for them. So it's nice being able to store those things separately.
It is, it really is. But I wanted to show you a kind of pure migrations tool as well. Now, I know Paul Stavel you wrote DBUp, or you were part of the team that wrote it, weren't you? So yep. DBUp is one migrations tool. This is Flyway. Both are perfectly good. Both do more or less the same thing. They take a bunch of ordered migration scripts and they run them in sequence. I like Flyway because it's cross-platform. DBUp is SQL Server specific, right? Or have I got that wrong?
I think out of the box it's SQL Server specific or anything else that's kind of a standard .NET data provider. And then there's plugins for various things. So there's plugins for SQL CE and stuff like that.
Cool. So I'm just going to give you a quick tour around Flyway. We have a conf directory where there's like a config file where we set stuff up, like where is the target database that we're pointing to, and that's just a path, and then there are various other settings that I'm not going to go through in a huge amount of detail, but just so you can see, it's kind of a config file where you just set all of your variables in here. And let's put that away. We also have a .SQL directory, and this is where we add a bunch of SQL scripts, a lot like in ReadyRoll, how there was just an ordered list of migration scripts. We just add an ordered list of migration scripts to this directory. If we look at the Flyway database, you'll notice there's an additional table in here called schema version. This is fairly typical. Often there will be a schema version or a history table, and you can query this to find out kind of what version the database syncs us up to. So the database syncs us up to version 1, which is where it's defined the baseline. I'm not going to get into too much detail. So what you can do, and finally, the bit that works, the bit that handles everything is this flyway.cmd. So you can just call this from the command line with various commands to migrate the database or roll back a database or whatever you want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new SQL file into the .SQL directory, So I'm just going to shortcut this just by copying and pasting the original one and renaming it. O2 underscore demo, for example. And in this SQL file, let's delete all the code that was there to begin with. I'm going to replace it with the code I wanted to run. So select all, copy, and paste that in. So now I have my SQL command saved as a script in Flyway. Now that's actually living inside a Git repo. All of this Flyway stuff is, if I just go one level up, it's in a Git repo where I've got a new spec file which I can use later on to package this all up and create a NuGet package for it, which I can then deploy with Octopus Deploy. So what I can do is I can just open up a command prompt to that location, and one of the things that we did was we added the accepts tiger cubs column to the kitten trainers table. So just to prove I'm not cheating, I'm going to refresh that now. And now if I go into my command window and just type flyway migrate, it's going to ask me to authenticate myself against the database. So I need to type in a user and a password. It'll be done in a second. So if we now refresh here, you can now see the accept tiger cubs column exists. So that successfully deployed that change to the dev database. So I've created my script and I've deployed it to the dev database. There are also options there's kind of a flyway clean option that I can use, which will just drop everything from the database and redeploy all the scripts, which is really, really useful in a dev domain, but whatever you do, don't do that on production, because as I said, it's going to delete the database, losing all of your data and redeploy all the scripts. So that's really, really quick and easy in the dev domain, flyway clean. Blast it all away, flyway migrate, it deploys all of your latest source code, all of the same scripts in the same order every single time, but I certainly wouldn't be using that command on production. Okay, so that's got my database up to date in dev, and I've made my change to my source code. So what I'm going to do now is commit that to source control. So git add all and git commit. Oh, I forgot to do a message, commit message. So some message escaping Vim is always easy. And apparently I've somehow managed to escape. Done. There we are. Escape
Hey,
Vim.
there you go.
And now I need to do a git push. Done. So that's pushed that up to the remote. So let's just go back into TeamCity and remember which builds are running. So let's run the Flyway build. And do I trust running the ready roll build? So I'm going to try it. Demo gods, I'm going to warn you. Immediately before the demo, I did do a run through. I ran the build for the ready roll database and it failed on me. So I need to go back and work out how that was. Hopefully, I'm being honest with you guys. Hopefully it'll work magically, but not sure if it will or not. So that's running all of my builds. In the meantime, so I've now kind of compiled my source code using 3 different approaches: a purely migrations approach, a purely model-driven approach, and a kind of hybrid approach that uses a bit of both. As all of these are going to be packaged up, I'm going to be creating NuGet packages for each one of these. The NuGet package for the Redgate SQL source control or toolbelt demo is just going to basically have a desired state. So if I look inside this NuGet package, what you'll see is a whole bunch of scripts to define the database. It's taking a long time, and you're not that interested, so I'm not going to drill into that. The package for Flyway is just creating an ordered list of migration scripts. The package for Ready Roll is doing that kind of hybrid combination of both. Once all of those builds have run, I can run a deployment in Octopus Deploy. Now, there are plugins for every single one of these tools, whether you're using Flyway, whether you're using SSGT, whether you're using ReadyRoll, whether you're using Toolbelt. There are already step templates on the Octopus Deploy library to help you deploy those packages. I personally wrote the Flyway one myself. Is there one for DBUp as well, Paul?
No, DBUp is a library that you embed in your application or in like a console app. So usually it just takes the form of a single line PowerShell script that calls the executable. I'll show that later actually if we get time.
Cool. But for all the others there are. Now, the SQL Toolbelt one, let's start there because this was already triggered to start, but I actually put a manual intervention step into here. You'll see this one is waiting on some sort of manual approval. One of the things it does for you, which is really quite nice, is it creates a bunch of resources for you. So this changes.html is a really nice document that can be automatically generated for every single change or for every single deployment. So that poor production DBA who had to review kind of every single deployment and they're all using different approaches, this is exactly the sort of thing that John Morehouse would have loved, an easy ability to be able to see, right, what has changed, what objects have changed, do I have any warnings? Well, no, I don't, that's great, and what's the actual upgrade script that's going to be applied? And now what I can do is I can reuse, it's called a release, a DLM database release. Of course, there is a slight Octopus Deploy talk about releases as well, so we're now all overloading that term. So Redgate SQL Source Control is part of the SQL Toolbelt, as is DLM Automation, which does all the automation bits. That's all kind of grouped together as SQL Toolbelt. But we get what's called a DLM database release. That includes your upgrade script. It knows the design state that it's meant to have before and afterwards. So when it does a deployment, it can check, am I in the right state to begin with? Can I run this exact script, and am I in the right state to the end with? So when we go to production, we still are running a known script, and we could still run this exact same release on a staging and a production environment. So we do get that repeatability of rerunning the upgrade script, but it's just not quite pushed as far left as it would be in a purely migrations model of working. So you get a nice review document here, and then this ties in really well with the manual intervention step in Octopus Deploy. So I can, as a DBA, for example, I can assign this this manual intervention step to me. It can say review the deployment resources, say you're happy, and once my computer catches up, I can click okay, happy with that, proceed, and that will go on to execute the rest of the deployment against the target database. And as I say, I could reuse that same
cool. Like, what I love about that is, like, we've all been in those environments where when it's time to deploy your app to production, you take the SQL script and you email it to the DBA, and they paste it into Management Studio and they scroll up and down, kind of reading through it. Then they select each part, bit by bit. They make sure to include the where clause with the delete clause when they run it, that sort of thing, and then they run it step by step. And what this does is sort of allows the DBA to stay in the loop. They can see exactly what's going to get run, but they don't have to be the one pasting it into Management Studio. And that's really nice because if your DBA goes on holiday or they're not there to do tomorrow's production deployment for some reason, one of the biggest challenges in a large enterprise is like just finding someone else who has access to be able to do that. Whereas it'll be a lot easier to find someone else who sort of has approval to look at the script and kind of give it a thumbs up without them having to kind of go and get permission to go and run it against the database. And you get an audit log so everyone can see this is exactly what was run and who approved it and so on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's just check the Flyway build is finished. The Flyway build is finished. The Ready Roll build failed. Oh well, I'm not going to try and troubleshoot that mid-demo. The Flyway build succeeded, so let's look at the Flyway build. And what I can do now, I hadn't set up the automatic release creation here, so I probably should have done that in advance. But I can click into the Flyway project. Before I do that, by the way, I'd just like to go and take a look at the process here to show you the step template. This is available on, if I just go to Octopus library, you'll probably find it. There we are, Octopus Deploy library. There is a step template for it. What am I looking for? I'm looking for Flyway. So there's a Flyway migrate step template that you can just add into your own Octopus Deploy instance from the library. And it's a fairly straightforward step template. I will caveat this with this is the first thing that I ever actually wrote for public consumption, so it could probably be improved a fair amount. But in here, all we need to do is specify the target database that we're deploying against. Because there's like a deploy package step and then separately there is a Flyway migrate step, we need to specify which was the step that downloaded the package. We need a relative path to the command to the actual Flyway executable, or that should probably be exported out so it's not actually inside the NuGet package. Depends whether you want to go headless or not. If you want all of your SQL files are in a different location, where's the target database that you want to deploy to, user and password. I also added, so when I built this as a Redgate employee, if I was going to build a deployment tool for an alternative, for a Redgate competitor, I had to put something a bit in there for Redgate because otherwise I probably would have been fired. So I added an ability to run a drift check, which I thought would be quite useful because, as we talked before, if you have any database drift going on, then that can cause serious problems, and we'll talk a bit about that later on. So we can, basically this is just calling Redgate SQL compare to build a shadow database. It's supposed to be the same. Then it can check that the shadow database is up to the correct starting place as your target database before you run the deployment. So you can check that you're all in sync before you actually run your deployment. So if you've got the Redgate toolbar, you can use that as well. But as I say, you do not need that to do this. You can just use it purely for Flyway to deploy your Flyway project without any Redgate tools. Yes, I want to discard changes because I can't remember what I changed. So I can create a release here, and I can save that, and I can deploy it to test using Octopus Deploy. Now, I'm conscious of time. I think I've already gone way over time that I was planning to on the demo. So I would love to go back and show you some more Ready Roll, and I'd love to go back and show you SSDT. But I think what I've tried to do is kind of give you a flavor of the different tools and different approaches that are available to you. And I want to show you that both a model approach and a migrations approach can work. Both of them can work. The question isn't about whether or not they work, it's about whether they work well or not. Oh, hang about, I'm in the wrong slide. Come on, let's go and find where I was up to. Right. So both of them can work in a fairly straightforward scenario, but let's talk about when they go wrong. Okay. So in this new scenario, I've got two separate developers or two separate teams are doing two separate pieces of work at the same time. Maybe they're working on different feature branches. Maybe they're just not coordinating themselves very well. Whatever. Two of them have got two different pieces of work to do. One of them wants to add a column to the view because that view, Kitten Train is near London. We also want to grab the accepts Tiger Cubs column in that because it was a London customer that wanted that information. And also, I've decided that I don't want to have a full name column. I want to have separate first name and last name columns. So I'm going to be splitting that column up. So I need to make a couple of changes now. So let's go with a migrations approach first. The first developer comes along and edits a view and adds the accepts Tiger Cubs column. The second developer comes along and alters the table, and by doing that, I've simplified this somewhat to fun with strings. What's actually happening there is the developer is creating a brand new first name and last name column. It's going to look through the full name column and try and work out how to split that data up into the first name and last name. Now, that could be quite simple. Just find the space and look at what comes before and look at what comes afterwards. But actually, when we apply that logic to the real world, what happens with people with middle names? What happens with people who have put their prefixes in there, Mr., Mrs., Doctor? What happens with people that don't follow Western standards? And it takes a human being with a little bit of cultural knowledge to actually understand what you want to do with the data in that scenario. So that's where humans really have value, working out how we're going to split those strings up. And move the data across, and then eventually I'm going to delete the original column. And then underneath I need to alter the view because the view depends on the table, so it doesn't want to select full name because that would break the view. We want to select first name, last name. Okay. I don't know if anybody can spot it. If I was in a room with people, I'd be saying, who can spot the mistake here? But since I'm not, I'm just going to show you. When you run alter statements, the last one wins. So no matter how many times, no matter what order I run this alter view statement, neither time it's going to be correct. If I run the first alter view statement from script 124, I'll end up with full name and accepts Tiger Cubs. And if I run the second script, I don't get anything to do with Tiger Cubs, but I do get first name and last name. There's no way I can run this. There's no order I can run this to not screw up. And so this is kind of demonstrates the problem with the migrations way of working. When you have lots of developers working in parallel, making frequent changes, if you end up with a long list of changes, it can be really, really difficult to manage that and to kind of figure out who's changed what and when, especially if you start going down different branches of development. You can end up with some real problems. Fundamentally, the migrations way of working is a really bad way of working with stored procedures, views, functions. It just doesn't work very well with those. Now, at this point, Paul might have some opinions on what I just said there.
I do agree completely, but the one nice thing about the migrations approach is that it at least is going to be deterministic. So when those two developers check them in, it's not like it's going to randomly pick which one wins, right? It's always going to apply one then the other. The result will still be wrong. But presumably, if you're deploying that to a test environment, you're going to run something that then uses that view. At least you'll see, hey, there's a column missing, or the query fails or something, and so you can fix it, and then the same thing's going to run in prod. So as long as you're testing what you're building, you should still catch those things.
I would hope so. How many people, in your experience, are properly automatically testing their database code? How many people have unit tests against their stored procedures?
Well, not even automated, but even if you have a test environment, you must have it because you're planning to test, even just manually, something that you're doing. So as long as you're not writing your migration scripts, merging them all together, and then running them directly in prod, if they're in some kind of test environment, hopefully you'll catch those issues. But I do agree.
So what you're suggesting,
kind of
there should be some sort of, between development and production, there should be some sort of intermediate period where we're kind of reviewing the deployment and massaging the deployment through the door.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Which means you end up back on the other side of things anyway. So that's you've seen both the purity and the positives of the migrations way of working, but you've also seen the flaws. But just because there are flaws with the migrations way of working, let's see if we can fix that by moving to a state way of working, right? I've just criticized the migrations way of working. Let's see if state can handle this any better. So let's take that view, because that's where we had the problem. This is our original version. One developer comes along and writes this version. Now you'll notice it's a create statement because we're defining the desired state. The next developer comes along and writes this version, and we still have a problem, but merge conflicts, they're a solved problem. Okay, we're now working on the same set of files. Two people make the change to the same set of files. There are diff tools that can, this is just kdiff, it's an open source tool. There's beyond compare, there's Git will catch the stuff for you automatically. There's going to be all of the tools around DevOps for application code are designed to catch these sorts of issues and solve them for you. So this problem, when you're dealing with a desired state, a model, is kind of a solved problem. However, what we end up with is a before and an after version that looks a bit like this. So on the one hand, we've got create table as full name and accepts tiger cubs, and the create view as full name. And our new version, which has got both changes applied to it, is create first name, last name, and accepts tiger cubs, and select first name, last name, and accepts tiger cubs in the view. So now what I'm going to probably do is use some software to try and generate the upgrade script. Paul, have you got any ideas about how this is going to screw up? I should apologise to Paul because I've not given him an opportunity.
Questions panel. I was paying attention.
Okay,
I was reading the questions panel.
I hadn't prepped Paul for that, and it is about 2 o'clock in the morning his time, so I'll forgive him. So if you compare the two,
if I was the DBA, I would just run this in production now and find out.
What would actually happen is probably software would come up with a script that looks a bit like this. And if you've still not spotted the problem, it's right there. Okay. I no longer have a full name column, but I do have a first name and a last name column. Now, beforehand, I talked about how a human being is going to write that migration script, how I'm going to carefully pick the data apart and do whatever's right for my data to merge it into those 2 separate columns. Software can't do that for you. Software doesn't have any cultural context about a bunch of different names and able to work out what the correct first name and last name is. It can't do that. And this would be a fairly disastrous thing to happen on your production database. If you just kind of blindly ran this deployment without having tested it first, without using a reliable upgrade script that's been tested, if I ran this on production, I'm going to lose data. And that probably means I'm going to be sprucing up my CV by the end of the evening. So the problem with migrations is that you need to understand the tooling that you're using, and you need to have a plan B. You need to have some sort of process to actually, you need to know what's going to happen when it goes wrong, and you need to have some sort of override, which doesn't feel like it fits many of the boxes of DevOps and automation, where they say build once, deploy many times. That doesn't really work for this. So there's a problem there. So which one is better? Now, Paul obviously thinks migrations is better. This is my view. So if your organization looks more like, if the stuff on the left sounds more like you and your database and your team, probably a migrations-based solution is going to suit you better. Sorry, model-based solution is going to suit you better. If the stuff on the right feels better, more like your team, then probably the migrations way is going to work for you. And what I would say is actually one of the reasons why a lot of the DevOps folk and the continuous delivery thought leaders like the one on the right is think about what they're talking about. They're talking about flat data structures. They're talking about just tables. They're talking about taking stored procedures out of the database. They're talking about microservices. They're talking about lots of tiny little databases. Okay, that sounds like the sort of database that is going to work quite well in a migrations way of working. But let's talk about the other group of people. Let's talk about the people dealing with these big, complicated legacy database systems where there's a lot of heroics going on in production, a lot of hotfixing going on in production. Actually having a clear view of what the whole thing is supposed to look like can be really, really useful. And yes, it's not quite as good in terms of automation and deployment, but the benefits you get there in terms of being able just to manage your development process a lot better can sometimes outweigh that. I've summarized at the bottom. Model solves a lot of the problems associated with team-based database development. Migrations solves a lot of the problems associated with automation and deployment a lot better. So you've got to pick which are the problems that you have. In some ways, model feels more agile and migrations feels more DevOps, which is an odd distinction to make, because often you think of those two things going together, but I do think that model feels a little bit more agile. Just make it so I can try this out, try that out. Feels a lot easier to do stuff, whereas migrations feels harder to do stuff but easier to automate and more pure and simpler. Doesn't rely on any custom tooling, or typically model does require some sort of expensive software to actually work out that migration script, because that's not something that's easy to develop yourself, or there aren't really very many open source database diff tools available. So it probably does mean you've got a licensing cost associated with model as well. It's worth mentioning there are a bunch of hybrid options. So ReadyRoll, we've already mentioned, has kind of it splits out the database into data structures, which it does with migrations, and your programmable objects, which it does with model. SQL Server Data Tools, SSDT, has something called a refactor log, where you can kind of program in, this is a table rename, this is a column split, and you're kind of helping the software out to work out those issues. You also have pre and post deployment scripts, which you can kind of handle a lot of the complicated data merging there, just the difficult stuff you can do in your pre and post deployment scripts, and then you can let the software work out the 90% case where it just makes your job quicker and easier. SQL source control, Redgate toolbelt option has a feature called migration scripts, where you can say, right, what I'm doing now is a column split, for example, so here is the precise script that I want to give for that. So whenever you come across something in the software that works out script that you don't like, you can provide your own patch for that. You can provide your own alternative upgrade script. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can slice and dice the model and the migrations approach to try and find something that works for you. What I would say is that with these tools comes a lot of power, but also comes more complexity, and complexity is something that we like to avoid as well. So it is a balancing act, and you need to pick something that's appropriate for you. In many ways, if you only make a change once a month and you're only a couple of people, then actually using something simple like Flyway or DBUp might just be simpler than all of this. So there are pros and cons. I've tried to split it up a bit into kind of which tools might work well for you. So remember, do you think that you're more of a model sort of organization or a migration sort of organization? So I've split it up that way. I've also split it up based on, do you want to spend money or do you want to use the free tools? I should caveat that with, as I said, ReadyRoll. If you buy the most expensive version of Visual Studio, you do get ReadyRoll. You do get a version of ReadyRoll for free, but it doesn't have that programmable objects feature in it. So you have to pay Redgate a little bit of money to get that programmable objects feature and one or two other features as well. They've gone freemium, but they do like getting paid at the end of the day. So there are a bunch of options that are available to you. All of those do plug in quite neatly to Octopus Deploy. So if you're Octopus Deploy users, any of those should be options. I would like to finish with a little bit talking about drift. This is all of this kind of goes out the window when people start making changes outside of your development process. If any of you have worked with this guy, you'll know quite how frustrating he is. Somebody else smart said that when making a change directly on production, you're making the decision that the delay due to poor cycle time is more expensive than the risk of making a mistake. Now, what I'm talking about here is cycle time. How long does it take for you to go from making a change in dev to seeing that change deployed to production? There are other definitions as well that include feedback loops and stuff, but just for the time being, how long does it take you to make a change in dev and push that through to production? When I talk to database folk, typically I get an answer between 2 weeks and 4 weeks, typically. Sometimes it's several months, sometimes it's years, sometimes it's 15 minutes. But typically I hear 2 to 4 weeks is the average. Okay. Now, the reason why we're making these hotfix changes on production, which no, they're not a good idea, they're a bad idea, but the reason why we're doing it is because we're losing $1 squillion a second because there's some bug in production that is absolutely just stopping my users from doing anything, and that's unacceptable. Okay. And so the cost to the business of waiting 2 to 4 weeks to get that out during a normal development process is very, very significant. So the risk of making a mistake, it may be judged, is less. The cost of that is less than the cost of delaying. Now, I put it to you that as a developer or a DBA, I'm not very good personally at guessing whether or not I'm going to make a mistake. A lot of the time I think this will work fine, and it doesn't. Okay. Also, so first of all, we're trying to carry out this complicated calculation in our head, because actually there are a lot of factors that go into this calculation. We're trying to work out this calculation in our head, and it's not an easy or trivial one for us to work out. And frankly, as humans, we're probably rubbish at doing that math. Okay. The other point that I make about this is there are also a whole bunch of inefficiencies that come later on down the line. By the way, that was me that said that. So the bad stuff that happens, we end up with accidental rollbacks. If we're using a model-based approach and we're comparing what's in source control to what's in production, and there's been some special fix in production, I'm going to deploy my code and I've undone the change. Well, if someone went to the lengths of making the change directly on production, then they probably didn't want it to be rolled back the next time I deployed a release. We can have failed deployments. So if there's something I'm not expecting on production and I'm running a known migration script against production, it can blow up in my face. I might have a conflict or something, or it might work fine. And then I have some environment inconsistency on production, which renders all of my testing that I'm doing on development invalid because I'm not using the production version of the code. So there are all these inefficiencies, and the risk of error increases significantly. So I might be solving a problem in the short term, but I'm causing myself problems in the long term. Now, what should you do if there is drift? Well, there are two things. You've got to make a choice immediately. First of all, you should be monitoring for drift. You should know it occurs. When it does occur, you should make a decision. Do I want to keep this? Good, stick it in source control. Or do I not want to keep this? Good, roll it back. You should do one of those two things, and you should do it immediately the second you find out. Now, monitoring for drift is relatively easy in SQL Server. You can there's a blog post here which I shall add to the chat window. So this is a blog post by Phil Factor on Symbol Talk about how you can play with DDL triggers to fire off alerts and things whenever a change happens, and you can find out information about stuff like who made the change, when did they make it, what script did they execute. If you want, there's a free tool from Redgate that's available that can help you track this stuff called DLM Dashboard. So just go to the Redgate site and look for DLM Dashboard, and so they're both available. What I would say is, even though database DevOps can be hard, and I've shown you a bunch of different approaches and all of them have had their flaws, even though it can be hard, and even though it's a difficult learning and cultural process to go through, it is tremendously valuable. So these guys at Farm Credit, and now their error rate of deployments dropped. They were at a point where most deployments failed, and now they're at a point where barely any deployments fail. Almost all of them succeed. They're using Octopus Deploy, and they're using the Redgate tools because I worked for Redgate at the time and I did a good job as a salesperson. So they happen to be using the Redgate tools and Octopus Deploy, but as I said, many tools are available. A couple of them have moved on now. So John Morehouse now works at one of the sister companies where he's been tasked with doing exactly the same thing at that sister company. So that's kind of been seen as a model that's been rolled out. The guy in the middle, Bob Walker, he now goes and talks about database DevOps in lots of places, and he's kind of been seen as one of the people that has kind of really helped turn around that particular business's ability to actually deliver software updates. And I'd put it to all of you that no matter what role you are, no matter what role you have, I would suggest that being the person that is responsible for kind of significantly reducing the error rate of deployment and significantly increasing the speed at which you can get your stuff to your users, that's probably a good thing to have on anybody's CV, regardless of whether you're a developer or a DBA or whatever other role you have. So just to summarize, what have we learned through this whole ordeal? We've learned that siloed sparrows suck at DLM. We've learned that heated hippos are closed-minded. We've learned that clever people consider their options, including hybrid options, and they hunt this smug face and they make pain on it. We've learned that this stuff makes a big difference. I will add this link as well to the chat window, because that's in their own words, the results of the work that we did together. And that's how I'd like to finish, that this stuff does make a really big difference. Just briefly before we stop for questions, obviously you hopefully all are either using Octopus Deploy or considering using Octopus Deploy. It's a wonderful tool. If you want any help setting up any of the stuff that we've talked about today, database DevOps processes, if you want some help choosing some good tooling, helping to implement some tooling, or if you just want some advice about database source control in general, then do get in touch. There are various ways in which DLM consultants can help you. Oh, there are my image sources. If you care about them, then go on to then pause the video afterwards and look it up. Paul, how much time do we have for questions? I think we did overrun by about 5 minutes. I'm sorry for that.
Oh, we have. That's all right. We can keep going. Thanks for all that, Alex. All right. So a few questions that have come through. One is has come up sort of in three different times in different ways, but reference data. So imagine you've got, along with your schema, you've got things like a list of states that you ship to, or a product catalog, something that's just kind of static data that changes infrequently enough that you want to do it as part of a script. How do you handle that with the two different models?
Yeah, so there are various different ways. And it probably does come down quite a lot to the tool that you use. So SSDT, for example, you stick it all in pre and post deployment scripts. That's how they would do it. You'd have a pre or post deployment script that would update all the data appropriately. In Redgate SQL source control, is kind of a really cool feature. It's one of their killer features. You can select which data is static data. So in this case, the tool just I can just tell it that in this example I've got a cities. I've got some cities that I want to keep in source control. So I can select the cities because that's static data. They don't change very often. And so I can refresh my commit tab, and I will see the city data, and of course that doesn't actually have the data in it, which is frustrating. But if I'd had the data in there, you'd be able to see a whole bunch of insert statements here. Ready Roll has a similar feature where you can select one of your tables. Cities, we can select that table, include table data, refresh, and then what it will do is it will create a script for me that will insert the data, and it'll start managing it through migration scripts. If you're using an open source migration script runner, then let's just import that so you can see what it's actually going to do. So here you can see I did have the data in this table, so it's just created a script for me. And you could do exactly the same thing with dbup. So if I wanted to, I could just copy and paste this script into dbup or Flyway, and I could start managing it that way. Kind of in a migrations way of working, everything is a migration, whether it's a data migration or a schema migration. So you just manage it like that.
Yep, cool, very nice. So a few people asked about dbup when we were talking about that, and how that gets used, and mainly this problem of how you deal in the same way with Flyway with store procedures and views, those sort of things where it's just a big bang change to it. And someone also asked whether Octopus uses dbup, and we do. So I'm going to, hopefully this doesn't break everything, but I'm going to share my screen, and I'll bring up the Octopus solutions. So just let me know when that comes through.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, so this is Visual Studio. So this is the Octopus Deploy source code. It's a while since I worked on it actually, so it might be a few months old. But so we use dbup, and dbup is a library, a DLL that you reference from NuGet, and it gives you C# code that you call to say, are there any migrations to be run against this database? If there are, run them. So these are all of our scripts from basically the history of time. So, you know, the very first script in Octopus 3, when we moved everything into SQL Server, these were all the original tables that we created, and then more recently we've added columns to tables and all that kind of stuff. One of the cool things you can do with dbup is mix code that is C# code as part of the scripts as well, because sometimes you do have to pull things into like your ORM to make changes to, or compare with some data that's in your code that you can't easily do in SQL Server. So we end up using a mix of those, and then we also set up another folder which has things that get run all the time, and these are things that we can edit, I believe, over and over. And I think we'll start to move a lot of our store procedures and views and so on to there. So you can make dbup handle that, and I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. I might check if the dbup documentation has been updated, but that's how we use it. And like I said, so there's about 18,000 active installations of Octopus around the world. Every time we make a change to the schema, we put a script here. What's nice about this migrations-based approach is that goes out to customers. They run the software, it checks what schema they've got, and then just runs whatever is between the version they've got and the version that it needs to get to until it's all up to date.
And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, going back to one of the things I potentially didn't have on my kind of model versus migration slide that I probably should have had is actually if you're deploying to customers who are remote, like Octopus Deploy do, they've got thousands of installs around the world and they don't maintain them themselves, they pass it off to other people. The migrations way of working works really, really, really well there because you're just running the same scripts in the same way. If you'd been using something like a declarative approach, you would have needed to kind of ship the DDLs for the whole comparison engine along with it, and there would probably be licensing issues there as well. And you'll be running a comparison at the customer end where you can't see it and just trusting it to work out the script. So I think that for Octopus Deploy, a migrations approach is absolutely the right way of working. In many ways, the model-based way of working really works well when you maintain your own SQL Server instances like Farm Credit did.
I am liking the approach that ReadyRoll does with, and that I think there must be a way of making DB Update too, where you can have the views and stored procedures separately in files where they keep getting overwritten. Because that seems like those two examples you had where things broke, that seems like that solves both of those problems. I'm sure there's downsides to it, but
Yeah, well, there are, and if you speak to the development team at Redgate, then they'll tell you, right, we solved this whole class of solution problems. Now we've got this smaller class of problems that are slightly more complicated. But generally, yeah, it works really, really well. I've seen a bunch of people extend tools like DBUp and Flyway just by having a separate directory full of drop create statements for all the stored procedures, and then they just literally refresh all the stored procedures every time they do a deployment. And I've actually employed approaches like that in the past myself. It's fairly straightforward. You can just say, and then the only stuff that goes into your migration scripts is stuff that involves data, and stuff that doesn't involve data, just the schema objects, stored procedures, functions, and so on, views, then they're just added, they're just all kind of rebuilt after every single deployment.
And so the last question, so when we do web apps and we have a load balancer and we have multiple web servers, we've got a bunch of techniques we can use to keep the site always running. We can do rolling deployments where we take one machine out of the load balancer and other servers are still handling the traffic. And so that gives us these zero downtime deployments. How do we do that when it comes to database migrations, especially, some things like adding a column and so on could be done, well, depending on the size of the table, could take a long time, could be pretty short. Some changes can take a really long time. We've had migration scripts that we've run where for some customers, they had a lot more data than we ever expected in a given table, and it took an hour plus for the migration to happen. How do we approach that? And probably a related question is, how do we handle rollbacks as well if something goes wrong during one of these deployments? Maybe it's not related, I just want you to answer that question.
Two different questions, I think. So yeah, zero time down deployments for SQL Server is hard. It is hard. There's stuff that you can do with availability groups, but always thinking about backwards compatibility is the thing. So a lot of the time the problem is because you have an application and a database and they're dependent on each other and you've got to make the same change in both. So having a concrete rule about we will support X versions back can be a good idea. So you can deploy kind of the additive change, you can start squirting data in, and then you've got time to move the data across. So you can support both models, and then at some point you need to go and clean up. And that is an important point that sometimes gets forgotten, and then you end up with these horrible legacy systems where you've got 2 or 3 implementations of the code running at the same time. Always making sure you clean up afterwards is very, very important. And sometimes it can be hard to persuade that manager or that product guy who is saying we need to get this feature out the door. Sometimes it's hard to push back against that, but yeah, kind of expand contract releases. There's some stuff you can do with availability groups, buying very expensive replication software, but that can get very, very expensive. On the subject of rollbacks, that's you could do we could talk for an hour just on rollbacks. There are various different strategies. The golden strategy is take a backup beforehand, restore it, make sure you're happy with it, then do your deployment. If anything screws up, you've got the backup. You then need to think about first of all, downtime. Is the downtime acceptable? It may or may not be. If you're deploying 95 times a day, like Skyscanner do, then probably taking a backup beforehand is not going to be an acceptable solution. But let's say it is an acceptable solution because you've got a window where you can do that. The next thing you need to think about is a bunch of data has happened in the intermediate period between deploying the change and then wanting to roll back. And if you want to capture that, then you need to think about log shipping and stuff. You need to think about if we created a new table, put some data in there, and we're rolling it back, then we're losing that table and the data inside it. How do we handle that? Some people create up and down migrations, and so for example, Liquibase is a bit like is a similar tool to Flyway and DBUp, and it has up migrations and down migrations. Does DBUp have down migrations?
No, and we don't believe in it because I mean you're probably about to say the same thing, but
Yeah.
if you're if something's gone wrong during the deployment, like if you've written your up script wrong, you've probably written your down script wrong. And the thing with your up scripts are you've tested them 15 times in your dev environment, 10 times in your test environment, once in production and something went wrong. Your down script, how many times did you test that all along the pipeline? Probably zero. So what hope do you have that it's actually going to work in production? Our approach for this kind of stuff is if something went wrong, you didn't predict it. Whatever things you put in place to roll it back, you probably didn't really predict what was going to happen either. The tools should kind of step out of the way and let the humans take
I
control.
agree. So with rollbacks, there are basically two classes of rollbacks. One rollback is something went wrong, quick, we need to fix it, we want to get back to where we were. The other class of rollback is we released something, then we decided it wasn't a good idea to release it yet, we want to just pull it back.
Hmm.
Now, the downward migration is really, really good for that side of things, but it's not very good for when something went wrong. Because as you say, if something went wrong on the way up, then so by definition, you had expected to get from state A to state B. By definition, you're not at state B. So what are the chances of running that downgrade script is going to get you back to state A? It's not. It's going to get you back to something else. So, and like you say, it's even if you have tested it, but by every time you did a deployment to test, go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, just to check you can do it. Even if you have done that, you've probably not already foreseen the issue that you were going to run into and downgraded from that particular state that you ended up in. So I agree that I'm a bit skeptical of downward migrations, but each to their own. So what have we done? We've done backups, snapshots, VM snapshots and stuff that they can be useful. Snapshots, backups, downward migrations, and roll forward. Roll forward is becoming the fashionable approach to this. It's the fashionable way to solve this problem. Kind of just fix it and move on. I would say that it does rely on your ability to actually commit to source control, run a build, run your basic health checks, your tests, and deploy that in the space of about 5-10 minutes. Okay, so if you can commit to source control and get your change built and tested and into production in 5 or 10 minutes, good, you can do roll forward. And also, if you're skilled enough to actually be able to fix a problem, good, you can do roll forward. It takes some time to get there. It takes some experience. Like for a lot of people, just getting their head around Git is a bit of a learning curve. So trying to get your head around Git at the same time as trying to get your head around all the complicated issues around databases, at the same time as trying to get your head around build servers and release management tools. It is where we want to get to. It is the ideal place to get to, but I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to be your only backup option day one, because it's probably still useful to take backups until you get there.
Yeah. Whatever we do, we're still going to have people in the heat of the moment connecting via SQL Management Studio to production, and we have to deal with that. I do think what you said though about splitting up the changes is a great way to handle both rollbacks and the zero downtime stuff. So, let's say that you're adding a new feature and it requires one table to kind of be massively moved into something else. Instead of shipping those two things together, you can do the first release is no change to the app and just make the data changes by adding the extra table but not changing the existing one, so the old app still works. Once you're kind of happy with that, then the next change is to deploy that part of the app. And if you need to roll back, then you sort of know that everything's going to work. And then the last change is then to delete and clean up the data, which, like you said, is the part that everyone tends to forget. Or we like to keep things around just in case we ever decide we want to roll back. But sort of
and
having
then that
being
just
backwards
comes
compatible.
the legacy. that is the definition of all the legacy crud that ends up in your system that you end up breaking at some point in the future. And clean it up, get rid of it. Red, green, refactor. Refactoring databases is important. We shouldn't leave that stuff.
Now, someone asked regarding rollbacks, does anyone use database transactions? And this comes up all the time with DBUp. People ask, well, can't you just, because you write these big migration scripts, can't we just run the whole thing in a transaction? And the answer is, like, during a database schema migrations, there's a lot of things you can't do within a transaction. So I think adding columns, adding views, some of those things you can do, I can't remember offhand, but there's a bunch of things you just can't do within a transaction. But certainly within a script, if you've got 4 or 5 changes that are, especially like adding data or so on, by all means put transactions around them.
I think in general it's a good rule. In general, I think
yes, transactions are good.
Using transactions is good. We want to be using transactions where possible. Yes, there are some occasions where we can't, but that doesn't mean we don't use them where we can. We should be using transactions where we can. If you look at most of the tools that generate scripts for you, most of them will just by default wrap everything into a transaction, separated by a bunch of Go statements, and then at the end you'll have, if there have been any errors, then roll the whole transaction back. Yes, that works, but again, it only saves you from some classes of failed deployments. It only saves you for deployments where you've actually done something that SQL Server doesn't like, as opposed to accidentally broken some dependency on some stored procedure that's only compiled at runtime, which you only discover later on. So there are, just because your transaction passes doesn't mean that you've successfully deployed the code that you wanted.
Very nice. So another question, let's make this last question. So when you have all those migration scripts, and there's tons of them, and you're running them in dev all the time, the question is, can you just kind of make one SQL file that you send to people, or do you ship all of those migrations? Now, one thing we used to do in Octopus a lot is we would baseline. So internally, we would have we'd create all these migration scripts for every small change. There might be 20 or 30 of them. But before we release that to any customers, we would just collapse them all into one thing, remove any duplicate dependency stuff or whatever. Something where we renamed a column once, then renamed it again because we changed our mind. Obviously, we don't need the first script anymore. So collapse it all down into one big script, and that's what goes out as part of the main product. But to do that, we have to delete all of our databases that we have in our dev environments, because otherwise it's going to run a script that's going to conflict with everything else that's there. In production, unfortunately, we often can't do that, and so you do kind of so we're at the stage now where we can't really do any of that sort of baselining stuff. You have to ship the changes as you make them.
It's something that I see often people can sometimes do it when they bunch. I guess your production is a bit different from most people's production, because you've got thousands of productions out there in the real world, and you don't actually see most of them.
I find even large enterprises that can be quite common, right? Like you've got a bunch of developers who probably all have their own copy of the database. You've got to go and tell all of them, hey, drop your database and recreate it because we've baselined this script, collapsed a bunch of stuff. Or there could be a bunch of test environments that you just don't always have access to or don't always know that people are using.
There's definitely also a class of people that have maybe a few dozen customers, a few dozen big paying customers, enterprise software type packages. And for those people, a lot of the time I do see a lot of this chunking up, and a lot of the time they do it between their major and minor versions as well, so that when they have a new custom coming on, they just have, let's say they're on you're on what, 3.14 in Octopus Deploy? So they might have an initial get to version 1, then get to version 2, then get to version 3 script, and everything has been chunked into one thing there. And then you've got the packed scripts that go on from there. And then when they eventually go up to version 4, then they'll just take all of that and condense it into just one script that gets you from 1, 2, 3, 4, and then all of the packed scripts after that. So that's one thing that I've seen a few organizations do, and they've managed to make that work for them.
Very nice. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Alex. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good night, good morning, wherever you are.
Thank you very much for having me.